The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet town of Maplewood. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional flicker of porch lights and the distant hum of crickets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where life moved at a slower pace. But tonight, Marcus Johnson wasn't focused on the charm of small-town living. He was here for a bigger purpose, to lead. Marcus had spent years climbing the ranks in the bustling city of Chicago, earning respect as a dedicated and fair-minded officer. His reputation preceded him, marked by countless stories of diffusing tense situations and standing up for what was right. When the mayor of Maplewood reached out, desperate to clean up their struggling police department, Marcus saw it as an opportunity, a chance to make a real difference in a community that needed guidance. As he drove into town, the contrast between Maplewood and Chicago couldn't have been starker. Gone were the towering skyscrapers and honking taxis. Instead, there were wide-open fields dotted with trees and quaint houses with white picket fences. It felt almost surreal, like stepping into a different world. Marcus smiled faintly, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling inside him. This wasn't just another job. It was a fresh start, a chance to leave his mark. Pulling into a gas station near the edge of town, Marcus decided to fuel up before heading to his temporary apartment. He climbed out of his car, stretching his legs after the long drive. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and freshly cut grass, a comforting scent that reminded him of childhood summers spent visiting his grandparents in similar towns. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, leaning against the hood of his car as he watched the pump click steadily. But something about the scene caught his eye. A pair of patrol cars speeding past the station, their sirens wailing but lights off. Marcus frowned slightly, curious about what could be happening. Maybe it was nothing serious, just routine work. Still, his instincts kicked in, the part of him trained to notice details others might overlook. He reached into his pocket for his phone, intending to check local news updates, but clumsily dropped it near the rear tire of his car. Bending down to pick it up, Marcus didn't hear the sound of the patrol cars returning until they were almost upon him. 3 officers stepped out, their body language tense and wary. They approached him quickly, their eyes scanning his casual attire, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sneakers, and the out-of-state license plates on his car. To them, he looked out of place, unfamiliar, and possibly dangerous. "Sir, can we see some ID?" one of the officers asked sharply, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Marcus straightened up slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. "Of course," he replied evenly, reaching for his wallet. But deep down, unease began to creep in. Something about the way they were looking at him, their suspicion, their readiness to assume the worst, felt all too familiar. And little did he know this encounter would spiral into something far more complicated than either side could have imagined. The 3 officers stood in a loose semicircle around Marcus, their expressions hardened and unyielding. The dim glow of the gas station lights cast long shadows across the asphalt, making the moment feel heavier than it already was. Marcus could sense their tension, their unease, but he tried to stay calm. He had been in situations like this before. Moments where people judged him not by his actions or words, but by the color of his skin. It wasn't fair, but it was something he'd learned to navigate over the years. "Can I help you with something, officers?" Marcus asked politely, holding up his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. His voice was steady, measured, the kind that came from years of training and experience. But his attempt at reassurance seemed to have the opposite effect. One of the officers, a younger man with a scruffy beard, narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening on the grip of his flashlight. "You're out here late," the officer said, his tone clipped. "What's your business in Maplewood?" Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The pause gave the officers an opening they didn't need, an excuse to dig deeper. "I'm new in town," Marcus explained calmly. "Just got here tonight, actually. I stopped for gas before heading to my place." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license. "Here's my ID." The lead officer leaned in to inspect it, his brow furrowing as he read the name and address. "Chicago, huh? What brings you all the way out here? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment where things could either go smoothly or take a turn for the worse. I'm the new police chief, he said simply, his tone confident but not confrontational. I start tomorrow. For a brief moment there was silence. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them, a taller man with a thick mustache, snorted derisively. Yeah, right. Police chief? Pull the other one. Marcus felt a flicker of frustration but pushed it down. He was used to skepticism, especially when people underestimated him based on appearances. Still, he kept his composure. You can verify it if you want, he said evenly. Call the station. My credentials are on file. But instead of easing the situation, his words seemed to make things worse. The younger officer stepped closer, his body language aggressive now. Don't play games with us, he snapped. If you're really who you say you are, why aren't you wearing a uniform? Why didn't anyone tell us you were coming tonight? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the third officer, a wiry man with sharp features, cut him off. Enough talk. Let's see what he's hiding. Without warning, he grabbed Marcus by the arm and spun him around, pressing him against the side of his car. The cold metal dug into Marcus's chest as the officer began patting him, down roughly. This is unnecessary, Marcus said firmly, though his heart was starting to race. He knew better than to resist. It would only escalate things further, but that didn't mean he had to stay silent. I told you who I am. You're making a mistake. A mistake? The younger officer shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We'll be the judge of that. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, curious bystanders drawn by the commotion. Some watched quietly, while others whispered among themselves. Marcus caught snippets of their conversations. What's going on? Is he in trouble? The attention made him feel even more exposed, like he was under a spotlight with no way to escape. As the search continued without finding anything incriminating, the officers grew increasingly frustrated. Their initial suspicion had turned into something uglier, fueled by arrogance and misplaced authority. And then, in a chilling twist, one of them muttered something under his breath, a cruel joke about teaching outsiders a lesson. It was subtle enough that most wouldn't have noticed, but Marcus heard it loud and clear. Before he could process what was happening, the officers dragged him toward their patrol car. A rope appeared in someone's hand, looped carelessly around his waist. Marcus's mind raced. Was this really happening? Could these men, sworn to protect and serve, actually intend to humiliate him like this? As the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus clenched his fists, vowing silently that this wouldn't end here. Whatever happened next, he would find a way to make sure justice prevailed, for himself and for everyone else who might suffer because of such reckless behavior. The rope around Marcus's waist felt like a noose, tightening with every passing second. The officers didn't say much as they secured it to the bumper of their patrol car, but their smirks spoke volumes. To them, this wasn't about justice or duty. It was about power. They were sending a message, flexing their authority in a way that made Marcus's stomach churn. He stood there, his hands still cuffed behind his back, trying to keep his breathing steady despite the storm brewing. Inside him, "Let's see how fast you can run," one of the officers joked, his voice laced with mockery. The others chuckled, feeding off each other's cruel energy. Marcus locked eyes with the speaker, his gaze sharp and unflinching. He wanted them to see it, the quiet fire burning beneath the surface. But they weren't looking at him as a person anymore. They saw only what they wanted to see. A target. Someone who could be pushed around without consequence. As the engine roared to life, Marcus braced himself, planting his feet firmly on the ground. His mind raced through possibilities. Should he fight? Shout for help? Or play along until he found an opening to prove who he really was? None of the options felt good. Fighting would likely end in more violence. Shouting might draw attention, but also escalate tensions, and playing along meant enduring humiliation. For a split second, he considered all three, weighing the risks and rewards. Then the car jerked forward, yanking him off balance. The initial pull was brutal. Marcus stumbled, his sneakers scraping against the rough asphalt as the car dragged him slowly down the deserted street. Pain shot through his body, the burn of the rope digging into his skin, the sting of gravel tearing at his clothes, the ache in his muscles as he struggled to stay upright. Every instinct screamed at him to scream, to beg them to stop, but he bit down hard on those urges. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, Marcus focused on survival. He planted one foot in front of the other, forcing himself to walk even as the car pulled him forward. His legs burned with effort, and sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the dirt and grit clinging to his skin. It was excruciating, humiliating, but he refused to let it crush him. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "This isn't over yet." After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the car slowed to a crawl. Marcus managed to regain his footing, standing tall despite the pain coursing through his body. The officers glanced back at him, their expressions shifting from amusement to mild surprise. Maybe they hadn't expected him to endure it so stoically, or maybe they were starting to realize that this little lesson had gone too far. When the car finally came to a stop, Marcus stood there, panting but resolute. His shirt was torn, his arms scraped raw, and his dignity battered, but not broken. One of the officers got out, walking toward him with a strange mix of hesitation and bravado. "Had enough?" the officer asked, his tone mocking but tinged with uncertainty. Marcus met his gaze head-on, his jaw clenched. "You have no idea who I am," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that silenced the man mid-sentence. "But you will." For a moment there was nothing but silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something about this situation wasn't sitting right. Still, none of them moved to untie the rope just yet. Instead, they hauled Marcus into the back seat of the patrol car, slamming the door, shut with unnecessary force. As they sped off toward the station, Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. He knew what was coming next. An explosive confrontation, accusations, and possibly even attempts to cover up their actions. But he also knew one thing for certain. When the truth came out, these men would regret every decision they'd made tonight. The ride to the station was a blur of anger, pain, and disbelief. Marcus sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed behind him, replaying the events of the past hour in his mind. The rope had left deep red marks around his waist, and the scrapes on his arms and legs throbbed with every bump in the road. But it wasn't just the physical wounds that stung, it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a decorated officer with years of experience, being treated like a criminal by the very people he was supposed to lead. When they arrived at the station, the officers practically shoved Marcus inside, their confidence returning now, that they were back on familiar ground. They paraded him through the lobby, ignoring the curious stares of a few late-night staffers. "Caught this guy lurking near the gas station," one of them announced loudly, as if trying to justify their actions to anyone listening. Their tone dripped with arrogance, and Marcus could see some of the other officers nodding approvingly, buying into the narrative without question. Inside the main office, things escalated quickly. One of the officers pushed Marcus into a chair, leaving him there while they gathered around a desk, chuckling about what had happened. "Bet he won't forget this anytime soon," one of them said, earning laughs from the group. To them, it was all a joke, a harmless prank meant to put an outsider in his place. But Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. He knew better than to react. Every word, every movement would be scrutinized later. For now, he bided his time. As the laughter died down, another officer walked in, holding a folder. It was Sergeant Hayes, a grizzled veteran who'd been with the department for decades. He glanced at Marcus briefly before addressing the room. "Hey, isn't this the new chief supposed to start tomorrow?" he asked casually, flipping open the folder. Inside was a photo ID and a brief bio, clear evidence of Marcus's identity. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, then back to Hayes, as the realization began to sink in. One of the younger officers stepped forward hesitantly, his face pale. "Wait, what, him? No way." But Hayes didn't respond. Instead, he held up the photo ID, comparing it to Marcus's battered face. The resemblance was undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room as the truth hit everyone at once. They had just humiliated and possibly assaulted their new boss. For a moment, no one moved. The officers stood frozen, their earlier bravado replaced by shock and shame. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Now do you believe me?" No one answered. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the sound of someone dropping a pen onto the floor. Marcus looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. Some looked guilty, others terrified, but none met his gaze for long. He could see the weight of their mistake settling over them, heavy and unavoidable. One of the officers who had dragged him behind the car stumbled forward, stammering an apology. "Chief, we didn't know, we thought—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. There would be time for apologies later, for explanations, investigations, and consequences. Right. Now he needed to focus on regaining control of the situation. "I'm not interested in excuses," Marcus said firmly, leaning forward despite the pain in his body. "What happened tonight is unacceptable, not just because of who I am, but because of what it says about this department. You don't treat anyone this way, period." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this wasn't going to blow over quietly. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a scandal waiting to happen. And as much as they wanted to sweep it under the rug, Marcus wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. The weight of the situation pressed down on everyone in the room, but none more so than Marcus. He sat there, still cuffed and bruised, his presence commanding despite his disheveled appearance. The officers who had dragged him behind their car were pale, their earlier bravado replaced by a mix of fear and shame. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others fidgeted nervously, unsure of what to say or do next. For the first time, they weren't looking at Marcus as an outsider. They were seeing him for who he truly was, their leader. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing with decisions that needed to be made. He knew this moment would define not only his tenure as chief, but also the future of the department. If handled poorly, it could fracture trust within the ranks and alienate the community even further. But if handled correctly, it could become a turning point, a chance to address systemic issues head-on. "I want every officer involved in this incident to remain here," Marcus said firmly, breaking the silence. "No one leaves until we've sorted this out." His tone left no room for argument. The officers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't dare protest. They knew better than to test him now. One of the senior officers, Sergeant Hayes, cleared his throat and stepped forward, cautiously. "Chief, I think we all understand how serious this is. Maybe we can handle it internally, keep things quiet." His suggestion carried a note of desperation, an attempt to shield the department from public scrutiny. Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression unyielding. "No," he replied without hesitation. "This isn't something we sweep under the rug. What happened tonight wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. And it reflects deeper issues that need to be addressed." His words sent ripples through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded reluctantly, recognizing the truth in what he was saying. Still, there were murmurs of dissent. One officer muttered under his breath about bad press and ruining careers. Marcus caught it and turned his gaze directly toward the speaker. "You're worried about your career?" Marcus asked, sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Imagine how I feel right now. Imagine how the people of this town will feel when they hear about this. Trust isn't given, it's earned, and actions like yours make earning that trust nearly impossible." The room fell silent again, the gravity of his words sinking in. Marcus leaned back slightly, wincing as the movement tugged at his wounds. Despite the pain, he kept his focus razor sharp. "I'm calling for an independent investigation," he announced. "Every detail of what happened tonight will be examined, not just my treatment, but the mindset and behavior that led to it. That's non-negotiable." The officers looked at each other uneasily. An independent investigation meant transparency, accountability, and likely consequences. It was clear that some were already scrambling to distance themselves from the incident, whispering excuses or shifting blame. Marcus noticed but didn't call them out. Instead, he let them stew in their discomfort. As the night wore on, word of the incident began to spread beyond the station walls. A janitor who'd overheard snippets of the confrontation posted about it on social media, sparking immediate outrage. By morning, news outlets picked up the story, and protests erupted outside the station. Residents held signs demanding justice, while others called for resignations and reforms. The small town of Maplewood, once sleepy and unremarkable, was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. Inside the station, Marcus faced mounting pressure. Some colleagues urged him to step down, arguing that staying on would tarnish the department's reputation. Others accused him of using the incident to settle personal scores. Through it all, Marcus remained resolute. He refused to let fear or criticism derail him from doing what was right. By the end of the week, the state police had launched their investigation, interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, and documenting everything in painstaking detail. Marcus cooperated fully, knowing that transparency was key to rebuilding trust. As difficult as it was to relive the events of that night, he understood the importance of holding himself and the department to the highest standards. And though the road ahead promised to be long and challenging, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about punishing those responsible. It was about creating lasting change. For the first time in years, the people of Maplewood had a reason to believe that justice might finally prevail. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions for Marcus. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a fierce determination to turn this tragedy into an opportunity for change. He knew that simply punishing the officers involved wouldn't be enough. This was about addressing the deeper issues within the department and the community. It was about proving that accountability wasn't just a buzzword, it was a way of life. Marcus wasted no time getting to work. First, he called an emergency town hall meeting, inviting residents, local leaders, and members of the press. Standing before a packed auditorium, he didn't shy away from the truth. "What happened to me was wrong," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But it's not just about me, it's about what it represents. This department has struggled with trust for far too long, and I'm here to fix that." His honesty struck a chord with the audience. Many in the crowd nodded in agreement while others wiped tears from their eyes. For years they'd felt unheard, dismissed by a system that seemed indifferent to their concerns. Now, here was someone willing to listen and act. To rebuild trust, Marcus introduced sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training became a cornerstone of the department's new policies. Officers attended workshops designed to challenge stereotypes and foster empathy. At first, some resisted, grumbling about political correctness or claiming the sessions were unnecessary. But Marcus didn't back down. He led by example, participating in every session alongside his team. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Conversations that once sparked defensiveness started opening minds. Another major change came with the introduction of body cameras. Every officer, including Marcus himself, was required to wear one during their shifts. The decision wasn't popular with everyone. Some argued it would make them feel like they were under constant surveillance. But Marcus stood firm. "We serve the public," he reminded them. "And if we have nothing to hide, then there's no reason to fear transparency." Community engagement became another priority. Marcus organized regular meet-and-greet events where residents could speak directly with officers over coffee or at block parties. These casual interactions helped humanize both sides, breaking down barriers that had long divided them. Kids played catch with officers in the park, families shared meals with patrol teams, and neighbors finally felt comfortable approaching law enforcement, not as adversaries, but as allies. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were setbacks along the way. Some officers quit rather than adapt to the new policies, complaining that Marcus was changing the culture too fast. Others tested his patience, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go. But Marcus remained steadfast, refusing to compromise on his vision. When pushback came, he responded with calm resolve, reminding everyone why these changes mattered. One particularly tense moment came when a veteran officer publicly criticized Marcus during a heated staff meeting. "You're ruining morale," the man shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Marcus. Instead of lashing out, he leaned forward and spoke softly but firmly. "Morale isn't built on avoiding hard truths. It's built on doing what's right, even when it's difficult. If you can't stand behind that, then maybe this isn't the place for you." The comment silenced the critic, though it didn't win Marcus any friends among the more resistant members of the force. Still, many others rallied around him, inspired by his unwavering commitment to justice. Younger officers especially gravitated toward his leadership style, seeing him as a mentor who genuinely cared about making things better, not just for the department, but for the entire town. As weeks turned into months, the transformation became undeniable. Crime rates dropped, community satisfaction soared, and even skeptical residents admitted they noticed a difference. The national attention that had initially brought shame to Maplewood now highlighted its progress. News outlets praised Marcus's efforts, calling him a model for reform in policing. Through it all, Marcus never forgot the humiliation he endured on that fateful night. But instead of letting bitterness consume him, he channeled it into action. He proved that true leadership wasn't about wielding power. It was about using it to lift others up. And as the town of Maplewood slowly healed, Marcus found solace in knowing that his pain hadn't been in vain. It had become the foundation for something greater, a brighter, fairer future for everyone. Years passed and the town of Maplewood transformed in ways no one could have predicted. What had once been a fractured community plagued by mistrust and division became a shining example of progress and unity, and much of that change was due to Marcus's relentless dedication. His leadership style wasn't flashy or self-serving. Instead, it was rooted in humility, empathy, and an unshakable belief in the power of accountability. Slowly but surely, he turned the police department into a force that truly served its people. Marcus didn't do it alone, though. Along the way, he found allies, both within the department and among the residents. Some officers who had initially resisted his reforms came around after seeing the positive impact they had on their work and relationships with the community. Others joined because they admired Marcus's courage and integrity. Even those who remained skeptical couldn't deny the results. Crime rates were at historic lows, complaints against officers had plummeted, and public approval of the department soared. One of Marcus's proudest achievements was the creation of the Youth Mentorship Program. Recognizing that many young people in Maplewood lacked positive role models, he paired officers with teenagers through weekly activities like basketball games, art workshops, and career counseling sessions. At first, the idea faced resistance. Some officers worried about being seen as soft, while parents questioned whether cops could genuinely connect with kids. But over time, the program blossomed into something extraordinary. Officers shared stories of their own struggles growing up while teens opened up about the challenges they faced in school and at home. Bonds formed where none had existed before, bridging generations and breaking down stereotypes. The changes extended beyond policing. Inspired by Marcus's efforts, local businesses stepped up to support the community. Grocery stores donated food for outreach events, schools partnered with the department to teach conflict resolution skills, and churches hosted forums on racial reconciliation. The entire town seemed to rally around the idea that everyone had a role to play in creating a better future. Despite the progress, Marcus never lost sight of the scars left behind by that fateful night. The physical wounds healed long ago, but the emotional ones lingered, a reminder of how easily trust could be broken and how hard it was to rebuild. He often thought about the officers who had dragged him behind their car, wondering if they'd truly learned from their mistakes. Some had transferred to other departments, unable to face the weight of what they'd done. Others stayed, working quietly under Marcus's watchful eye, determined to prove they'd changed. When retirement finally came knocking, Marcus knew it was time to pass the torch. Standing before a packed auditorium during his farewell ceremony, he reflected on his journey. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But most importantly, it takes people willing to stand together, even when it's hard." As applause filled the room, Marcus scanned the crowd. He saw faces he recognized from his earliest days in Maplewood, officers he'd mentored, families he'd helped, and even some critics who had softened over time. Each one represented a piece of the puzzle he'd worked so tirelessly to assemble. In the years that followed, Marcus's legacy lived on, not just in Maplewood but across the nation. Law enforcement academies included his story in their training programs, using it as a case study in leadership, accountability, and reform. Community leaders cited his example when advocating for similar changes in their own towns. And every year the people of Maplewood gathered to celebrate the strides they'd made since that dark night, a testament to what was possible when someone dared to lead with purpose. For Marcus, retirement wasn't the end of his journey, it was simply a new chapter. Though he no longer wore the badge, he continued to speak at conferences, write articles, and mentor young leaders eager to follow in his footsteps. His message remained the same. True change begins with courage. And sometimes it starts with a single moment of reckoning, a moment that forces us to confront who we are and who we want to become. Years after stepping down as police chief, Marcus Johnson's name was still spoken with reverence, not just in Maplewood, but far beyond its borders. His story had become a beacon of hope for communities grappling with similar struggles, a reminder that even the most broken systems could be repaired if someone was willing to take the first step. For Marcus, retirement wasn't about fading into the background. It was about using his experience to inspire others and ensure that the lessons he'd learned weren't forgotten. In the quiet comfort of his home, Marcus spent hours writing a memoir detailing his journey from that fateful night at the gas station to the sweeping reforms that followed. The book, titled From Ashes to Trust, became a national bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and practical advice. Readers were moved by how Marcus turned personal pain into purpose, transforming not only himself, but an entire town. Schools adopted it as required reading, and law enforcement agencies across the country included it in their training materials. But Marcus didn't stop there. He traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, universities, and community events. His talks weren't lectures filled with jargon or empty platitudes. They were heartfelt conversations, blending humor, wisdom, and vulnerability. He often began by recounting the humiliation he endured on that dark street, not to elicit sympathy but to drive home the importance of resilience. "What happens to us doesn't define us," he would say, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's what we do next that matters." His message struck a chord with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. Young officers listened intently, inspired by his vision of policing rooted in service rather than authority. Community activists found courage in his example, learning how to hold institutions accountable without losing sight of collaboration. And ordinary citizens walked away feeling empowered to demand better from their leaders, while also contributing to positive change themselves. Back in Maplewood, the town continued to thrive under the foundation Marcus had built. Crime rates remained low, trust between residents and law enforcement stayed strong, and new programs emerged to address emerging challenges. The youth mentorship program expanded, now serving hundreds of kids annually. Local businesses flourished, thanks in part to the sense of safety and stability that had taken root. Even newcomers remarked on the warmth and unity they felt upon arriving, a stark contrast to the tension that once defined the town. Marcus returned to Maplewood often, always welcomed like a hometown hero. During one visit, he attended the unveiling, of a mural painted on the side of the old train station. It depicted a diverse group of people standing hand in hand beneath the words, "Together, we rise." As Marcus stood there, surrounded by smiling faces, young and old, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had worked for, not fame or recognition, but proof that collective effort could create lasting impact. Those scars, both visible and invisible, remained from that night years ago. Marcus wore them proudly. They served as reminders of where he'd been and how far he'd come. More importantly, they reminded him of the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. He understood now that holding on to anger would have only weighed him down, preventing him from achieving everything he had. As he grew older, Marcus cherished moments spent with his family, his children and grandchildren, who idolized him not because of his accomplishments, but because of the values he instilled in them. Sitting on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he reflected on his life's work. There had been challenges, yes, but also triumphs, moments when he saw glimpses of the world he dreamed of, however briefly. When Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, the nation mourned the loss of a trailblazer. Tributes poured in from every corner, politicians, activists, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens alike honoring his contributions. But perhaps the greatest tribute came from Maplewood itself. On the day of his funeral, thousands gathered along Main Street, lining the sidewalks to pay their respects. Children held signs reading, "Thank you, Chief," while adults wiped away tears, remembering the man who had changed their lives forever. Marcus's legacy lived on, not just in statues or plaques, but in the hearts of those he touched. In Maplewood, the annual Unity Day celebration continued to draw crowds, celebrating progress while acknowledging the work still ahead. Across the country, police departments embraced reforms inspired by his example, striving to build bridges instead of walls. And in classrooms, young people studied his story, learning that even in the face of injustice, hope and determination could light the way forward. For Marcus Johnson, life hadn't been perfect, but it had been meaningful. Through courage, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in humanity, he proved that real change was possible. And though he was gone, his spirit endured, guiding future generations toward a brighter, fairer world.